I love my son, but he's incredibly selfish. He is 2.5, and he's in that prime peak selfishness. Just the other day, Friday, he and I were sitting down, we were watching TV, and we were going to split a bowl of chips. We both love chips. Doritos, in fact. We love those. And so we sat down, and we did really good at first. Like, I would take a chip, he would take a chip. We were sharing. It was a magical moment until we started to get towards the bottom of the bowl, where, like, the crumbs are. And that's my favorite part. I like to pour it in my mouth. That's his favorite part. He does the same thing because he is my son. And so we started to get to the bottom of the bowl, and he actually, I reached in the bowl, and he growled at me. And I said, buddy, what's up? We're sharing chips. He goes, no, my chips. And I go, no, we got to share. We've been doing really good sharing chips. He goes, no! And he turned to keep the chips away from me, but he didn't just turn his body. He extended his whole little body on the couch to get them as far away from me as he possibly could because he is selfish. I didn't raise him that way. My wife didn't raise him that way. This is a prime example of how we as people, we are just naturally selfish creatures. And that's not just observation, by the way. That's science. There have been several studies and a little bit of research done into the social implications of selfishness, and been some really interesting findings. Basically, it doesn't matter what study you look at, they all come to the same conclusion. We are awful people. We're all just really selfish. But there are certain characteristics that are correlated with a higher level of selfishness. For example, men. If you're a man, you're selfish. But you can't help it, okay? We are just neurologically wired different. Our centers for reward, our neural reward system, it is triggered far more often by self-centered pursuits than by selfless pursuits. Women generally tend to be the other way, where they receive the biggest dopamine rush whenever they help other people. So men, we are wired to survive. Women, you're wired to help other people survive. And we can see this play out in everyday life. For example, my wife and I were driving in the car, and this has happened too many times to count, so I don't have a specific example, but we're driving in the car, a squirrel jumps out in front of the vehicle. Depending on who's driving, there's going to be a very different reaction to that. My wife, if she's driving, she's going to hit the brakes. Doesn't matter if there's traffic. It doesn't matter if we're on Main Street or Broadway. That squirrel is there. That squirrel has a right to life. I need to stop the car so he can survive. If I'm driving and the squirrel jumps in front of the car, it's just his time to go. I'm not going to hit the brakes and risk causing an accident. I'm not going to try to swerve and maybe lose control of the car. I'm selfish. I want to preserve my stuff. My wife wants to preserve nature. Men, we're just selfish. Here's some bad news too if you're a guy that's in good shape. Generally speaking, men who are physically fit tend to be even more selfish amongst selfish men. There's this correlation that the bigger your muscles, the smaller your heart. Not physically. This study, it shows men who are physically fit tend to be less generous. They have a harder time accepting the distribution of wealth to others. And that, my friends, is why I quit going to the gym. I want to be a better person, right? But before guys take any more abuse, ladies, 99% of the time, you are definitely more selfless than we are, except when it comes to chocolate. When the chocolate comes out, all that selfless junk, it goes right out the window. It's every woman for herself, right? Studies, time and time again, they show when women are offered chocolate, almost 100% of the time, they will take the biggest portions for themselves. Because you're selfish, just like the rest of us. We're all selfish creatures. And that's why we started this series 3 weeks ago called Selfless. We live in this society and in this world that encourages us to seek satisfaction and to seek a great life through self-centered gain. And so we focus on what we want, what we crave, what we desire. We try to fill our selfish wants, which is really a shame because when we look at Scripture and what God has to say about this life that He dreams and desires for us, what we see is that we don't get the most out of life by focusing on us, by being selfish. We actually get the most out of life by focusing on ourself less. And today, we're talking about one of the most challenging selfish desires that every single one of us experiences. This desire to gain. We all want more. We want more stuff. We want more money. We want more comfort. We want more square footage. We want more channels. We want more options. We want more possibilities. We all want to gain. We want more. And this desire to gain is one of the most challenging obstacles to living the generous life that God calls us to. And so today we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about 3 different mindsets that we oftentimes have when it comes to the relationship between wealth and generosity. Okay, there are more mindsets that we could have, but these are 3 really common ones. There are also 3 that the Bible speaks to and addresses. So we're going to do that this morning. We're going to kind of be all over the place in the Bible, but the first place we're going to be is in the Old Testament book of Haggai. If you got your Bible with you, feel free, open up to Haggai. Probably better served if you use the app or the screen this morning because we will be bouncing around quite a bit. So this first mentality that we're going to be talking about today, okay, this metaphor, we're going to call it the bag. All right, the bag. And when we have a bag mentality about wealth and generosity, we oftentimes find ourselves saying, there's never enough. There's just never enough. Does it ever feel that way? Let's unpack this idea about the bag. We're going to look at Haggai chapter 1, verse 6. Now, when Haggai wrote this, okay, he's rather speaking to the Israelites at a time in their history when they're being rather selfish. God had charged them with rebuilding his temple. It had been destroyed previously. So that was their job, build my house. And they got like halfway through it, and then they decided to focus on everything else. We're going to build our own houses, and not just like make them functional. We're going to put paneling up. They're going to be really nice. They're going to be lavish. We're going to get our fields and our cisterns and our vineyards taken care of. We're going to get all this stuff for ourselves done. And God, we'll get to him when we get to him. That was the mindset. So here's what God says to the prophet Haggai. He says, you have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but you're not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse. We might say a bag with holes in it. So when Haggai wrote this, okay, he wasn't thinking to himself, someday, thousands of years from now, there's going to be people that live in the Western Hemisphere that really need a framework for understanding how they spend their money. That wasn't Haggai's intention. And yet, what he's just said could describe so many people in our culture and in our society today. And it could describe a lot of us in this room today. We want to gain. We seek homes, we seek clothing, we seek food, we seek drink, we seek stuff. We seek to accumulate and to amass with the hope or the expectation that it will satisfy. And yet oftentimes, it doesn't. We find ourselves discontent, that's the word, not uncontent. We find ourselves discontent. We find ourselves dissatisfied, no matter how much we gain or accumulate or acquire. And that's the problem with this bag mentality. We live our life like a bag that has a hole in the bottom. We put our money in, but we spend it so fast that there never seems to be enough. We look at it whenever the emergency strikes, or whenever we really need to invest in something, or whenever we have this opportunity, and we go, where'd all the money go? I mean, I've got this fancy car, I got this new phone, I got this big house, I got all this debt, I've got all these things I've spent my money on. And when it comes to things that matter, when it comes to generosity, there just never seems to be enough. I can't be satisfied. That's the problem with trying to satisfy our wants through stuff. We've got this gap in our hearts and in our lives that we perceive, and so we try to fill it with stuff, thinking it'll content us, and then it does for a time. But then that contentment and satisfaction, it fades. You think about when you bought a new car. You bought like a new car right off the dealer's lot. You got in it, and then you went, that new car smell. That was great, wasn't it? What did that car smell like 6 months after that? You probably weren't going, it probably smelled a little funky. If you ate some fast food in there, if you got kids, it definitely smelled weird. It faded. Or that feeling you got when you got in that new car. When you first sat down, you bought it, you're like, new car, this is going to be great. 6 months from now, you get in that same car, it's not as exciting. It's not as new. It's not as satisfying. It's business as usual. That's the problem with trying to fill that gap with things and stuff and more and gain. It just doesn't satisfy for very long. It fades. And then we go seeking more stuff to try to fill that same gap. And over time, that fades. And so we seek more stuff. And we fall into this trap of materialism, thinking that gaining is the key to satisfaction. But the problem is we never stop wanting. Brian and I, we had this conversation a couple weeks after Christmas. We were both sitting down, and we were talking about how difficult it is to put together a Christmas list whenever you don't want or need anything. And we were both in this situation, like our wives were asking, like, what do you want for Christmas? And family was like, give me some Christmas ideas. And we're like, I don't know, socks? Like, we were both satisfied with where we were in life. We were content. But that didn't last very long. For Brian, it was a couple of weeks after that conversation. His brother-in-law had this shotgun. It was a semi-automatic 410. He thought, you know what? That'd be pretty nice to have. I could do this with that. I could do that with that. Squirrel hunting, we wouldn't have to lug around this big 12 gauge. Like, this would be nice. And that gap formed, and he wanted, and he desired, and so eventually he bought the shotgun, even though previously he was content and satisfied and didn't need anything. For me, the same thing happened at almost the same time. I didn't want a thing. I was content. I was satisfied. And then I was scrolling through Facebook on my phone, and this ad came up for a package of software, and I thought, that's a heck of a deal. I could do this with that. I could make movies with that. Like, I could do a lot of stuff with that. Previously, I didn't even know I wanted this stuff till I saw it, but once I did, I thought, I need it. Desire was born. Want was born. That satisfaction, that contentment, it faded. Gain is not the key to satisfaction and contentment. It's not the key to the life God desires and dreams for us, despite what our culture and our society may tell us. You know, if we live our lives with the bag mentality, living like, well, where'd all the money go? Because we spend it so fast, we will find ourselves oftentimes saying, I feel like I can never get ahead because there just isn't enough. Or I feel like I'm just barely staying above water because there's just never enough. I feel like I'm never going to reach this level. I'm never going to reach this goal. I'm never going to have peace. I'm never going to have contentment, satisfaction. I'm never going to have that safety net because there just isn't enough. Does that sound familiar to anybody? It is a stressful, ulcer-inducing way to live. And it's a direct result of this. Trying to find contentment and satisfaction through gain. And if you're feeling that way today, I want to encourage you, take a step back and take a hard, honest look at where the money's going. How much of it is going towards necessities? And when I say necessities, I mean like housing, food, utilities, and that's about it. And how much of it is going towards trying to gain? Gain more, gain comfort, gain ease, gain satisfaction? Are we living our lives like we have this bag with a hole in the bottom? The money just keeps falling out so fast, we feel like there's never enough. Here's the real twisted part about all this, too. Whenever we live our lives with a bag mentality, as if there's never enough, when we're convinced that's true, we're convinced that generosity becomes impossible. I wish I could give. I wish I could help somebody out. I wish I could pitch in and really be kind or generous, but there just isn't enough. It's a self-centered mentality that focuses all of our money, all of our financial situation on ourselves and what we want, what we can accumulate. And it focuses us so much on this myopic point of self that we lose track of the real key to satisfaction, helping other people, living selflessly. It's a tricky, tricky trap that Satan sets for us. And there was a guy in the Bible that lived with this bag mentality. His name was Judas. He was actually the guy that took care of the finances for Jesus and his disciples. And Judas, he was this guy that on the surface, he looked like he had it all together, but deep inside, he had this problem, this greed that just gnawed at him. And it shows up really plainly in the story in the book of John, chapter 12. Jesus and his disciples are at this lady's house. She's one of his followers. And they're having a good evening, having a meal together, and then she brings out this really expensive bottle of perfume. And when I say expensive, I mean like this was a year's salary's worth of perfume, okay? This was like a family heirloom. Maybe it was her dowry. Like it was something really special. And she pours all of it on Jesus' feet. And she starts to wash his feet with her hair. And in this culture, this is just this really special, beautiful act of worship. This is a beautiful thing. But Judas didn't see it that way. He couldn't. All he could see is that this was such a waste. He says, this is a waste. We could have sold this and used it to feed the poor. The reality was, he wasn't concerned about the poor. Judas had a nasty habit of always dipping into the money bag and taking for himself. And he wanted a piece of this pie. He wanted to gain. because he just didn't feel like there was enough. In fact, it's Judas's greed that would partially lead him to sell Jesus to the authorities for 30 pieces of silver because there wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed to accumulate. That's the bag. Whenever we live our lives with this bag mentality, seeking to find satisfaction through gain, we will find ourselves lacking, saying, there's just never enough. There's never enough to satisfy. There's never enough to be generous. There's never enough to help other people. There's just never enough. That's the danger of the bag. But if you notice the lady in that story, she really wasn't focused on trying to gain. No, instead, her priority was to give. She had this expensive bottle of perfume, and she didn't hesitate to worship Jesus with it. All right? And that brings us to this second metaphor I want to talk about, the second mentality. We're going to call this one the basket. Okay, the basket. So the bag, you say you never have enough. With the basket, it's the opposite. There is enough. When we live with a basket understanding of wealth and generosity, we find ourselves saying there is enough. And to unpack this metaphor of the basket, we're going to look at a passage from Deuteronomy chapter 28. Deuteronomy 28. And this is God talking to the Israelites. He's making a covenant with them, which means he's making a promise. And this is what God promises to his people. In verse 1, he says, if you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. All these blessings will come on you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. You will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. The fruit of your womb will be blessed, and the crops of your lands and the young of your flock, the calves of your herds and the lambs of your flocks. Your basket and your kneading trough will be blessed. You will be blessed when you come in, blessed when you go out. So as you're hearing this, there's probably a couple words that jump out at you because they show up a lot. The first is obey, and the second is blessed. And it's not a coincidence that these two words show up so close together because obedience and blessing tend to go hand in hand. And one of the ways that God says to the Israelites, if you obey me, I will bless you, is through your basket. Your basket will overflow. In other words, you will have enough. You don't need to worry about running out because there will be plenty if you just obey. So what does it mean to obey God? Well, the answer there, follow his commands. And if you look at the commands that God gave the Israelites, there's some about how to worship him. There's some about what they ought to do in the practice of worship together. But overwhelmingly, the majority of his commands are how to live with other people. Take care of the foreigner and the alien. Take care of your slave. Don't mistreat them. Don't charge interest on the loans you make to your brother and sister. Don't be afraid to lend freely, all right? These are all things that God is saying. Take care of those who can't take care of themselves. Be generous. So one of the ways they were to obey was to be generous. And God says, if you're generous in obedience to me, I will bless you, and there will be enough. And there starts to be this cycle you see forming here. If I obey God, if I am generous the way he calls me to be, he will bless me. Now, he doesn't bless me so that I can hoard it up and then adopt a bag mentality where I just spend it all on myself. He will bless me so that I can continue to be generous and obedient to him. And if I continue to be generous and obedient, he will bless me with enough that I can continue to be generous and obedient. Are you seeing the cycle here? In other words, what God is saying is if you just do as I ask, you won't have to worry about running out. You won't find yourself saying there's never enough. You'll find yourself saying there is enough. I can be generous. I can help other people because there's plenty. You know, it's kind of, if you want to think about it like this, there's this farmer, he lived a long time ago. This is before Monsanto and before you could like trademark and patent seeds and GMOs and stuff. This is a long time ago. This farmer every year had fantastic corn. In fact, it was award-winning corn. He took it to the county fair every year, won first prize. And he kind of had like this dynasty record showing up. And so the local paper, they came out, they interviewed him. They said, what's your secret? How do you grow such great corn year after year? And what he said really shocked the reporter. He said, every year I give great seed corn to my neighbors. And the reporter didn't really understand. They said, what do you mean? Like they're growing the same corn in the same county? Like they're competing against you. Aren't you afraid you're going to lose? He said, no, it doesn't work that way. He says, the way that corn works, when the wind stirs up, it blows the pollens from the nearby fields, and my corn gets pollinated by their fields. So if they have crummy corn year after year, it's only going to degrade the quality of my crop. But if they have great corn, if I take care of them, it's only going to serve to increase my yields. You see, I gain by giving. The farmer wasn't afraid of running out and of there not being enough. He understood there's plenty. There is enough. And that's what God has called us to do also. Understand that there is enough. We can help people out. We can be generous. We can give to good causes. We can help people out financially and with our things and not have to worry about running out because there is enough when it comes to the basket mentality. Look what Jesus has to say about it. The book of Luke, chapter 6. He says, give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, too, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be poured into your lap. For the same measure you use, it will be measured to you. So notice what he didn't say there. Jesus didn't say, keep, and it will be given to you. Hoard, and the blessings will overflow. You just overspend and overextend, and don't worry, it's just going to come running over into your lap. That's not what he says. That's the bag mentality. What he said is give, and it will be given to you. You see, when we focus on keeping, that's all we've got is what we keep. But when we're obedient to God and do as he asks, he does as he promises to do. He multiplies. And not just a little bit. If you read this, he says it's a good measure, pressed down, shaken. It's kind of like when you go to the convenience store, like Casey's or something, you get the Slurpee, and you're filling up your cup, and it gets to the top. You don't stop there. You shake it. You let it settle down. And then you put a little bit more in, and you shake it again. And then you put the dome lid with the big hole on the top, and you fill up that dome lid, and you shake it, because if somebody's going to charge me $3 for ice and syrup, I'm getting my money's worth, right? That's what God is saying. He says, if you just obey me, you don't need to worry. I'm going to take care of you. You will have enough. I'm going to shake the Slurpee and make sure you got plenty, okay? The basket mentality, it is a totally different mindset that starts to turn the corner from selfishness to selflessness. And there's a story from the life of Jesus that really depicts this basket mentality at play. It comes to us in 3 of the 4 Gospels. It might be all 4 of the Gospels. I forget at the moment. But it's the story of Jesus. He's got about 5,000 plus people gathered around, and he's teaching them kind of in the middle of nowhere. And they're there for a long time, this 5,000 plus people, to the point that like the disciples come to Jesus and they say, Jesus, you got to dismiss these people to go get a burger or something because they're going to get hangry and things are going to get ugly. And Jesus says, no, we're not going to dismiss them. You guys feed them. Now let that wash over you for a second, okay? These are 12, not just 12 people, 12 guys. You know how guys do in the kitchen, right? 12 guys. They have to feed 5,000 plus people. Do you have any idea how much that's going to cost? Understandably, they look at Jesus. They go, we can't do that. There's not enough. So Jesus says, go scrounge up what you can from the crowd and we'll see what we can do. And so they go through the crowd and all they find is this little boy who's got a lunch with him. 5 barley loaves, which are about the size of a muffin. 2 little sardine-sized fish. And it's not in the text, but I like to imagine that this boy has his lunch in a basket. It's not unreasonable, given the time period. So here comes this little boy with his little lunch, and Jesus says, can I have your food? Now, this is the part of the story we need to pay attention to. We oftentimes overlook this boy and his faith here, because he was smart enough to bring food. 4,999 other idiots didn't, but I got my food, okay? This is for me, this is mine, and if I give it up, I won't have enough. That's not what he does, though. God says, let me have your food. The boy gives his food generously. The story goes on. If you've heard it, you know Jesus works a miracle and feeds all of those people to the point that they were full, including the little boy, by the way. You see, he didn't lose anything. He didn't walk away hungry. He walked away just as satisfied as if he had kept all that food for himself, and 4,999 plus other people also walked away full. So even though it wasn't very much, it was enough. That's the power of the basket mentality. When we obey God, when we are generous as he calls us to, he multiplies the way he promises to. Not so that we can hoard. I'm not promising we're going to be multimillionaires and this whole church is going to be rolling around in Hummers or anything, but there will be enough. In fact, if you know how that story goes, you remember they collected all the leftovers into 12 baskets full of bread. That's more than what they started with. So in reality, there was way more than enough. And that's what brings us to this last metaphor we're going to talk about this morning. I like to call this one the barn. The barn. So you got the bag, and with the bag you say there's never enough. You got your basket, and with the basket you realize there is enough. But the barn you come to understand there is way more than enough. And this metaphor comes to us from the book of Proverbs, the book of wisdom, chapter 3, verse 9. It says, "Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops, and then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine." Now, Proverbs, like we said, it's a book of wisdom. It's instruction for how to live life well. What's funny about this is that a lot of financial advisors today would read this and say, this is not wise. If you put God first, you're going to wind up broke. There's a rule in personal finance. You've probably heard it before. It goes like this: pay yourself first. Anybody heard that? Yeah, pay yourself first. Let me tell you, that is a bag mindset. That's a mindset that says, I have to pay myself first because there might not be enough later on. Proverbs, on the other hand, says if you want to be truly wise, don't put yourself first. Don't focus on gain. Give. Put God first. And the funny thing happens when we prioritize God with His finances. Notice I said His finances. We'll get to that in a minute. When we prioritize God, when we make Him first, we realize there's actually way more than enough in my life. We start to see that maybe I had more money than I thought all along, and that maybe my money can go a lot further than I ever imagined or previously realized. You see, when your priorities are in line, and God is first, and you're generous to others second, and then you take care of your obligations, and you know what? You even got a little bit to have fun with afterwards. You realize my life is blessed. I'm not some bag with a hole in the bottom where I never have enough, and I'm not even some basket where I just have enough. I am a well-stocked barn. God has blessed my life, and I have way more than enough to be satisfied and content and have joy in this life. That's the wisdom of God's ways. Put Him first. Prioritize. This is a mindset of worship that understands a very simple principle. Everything I have belongs to God. We use that phrase, give to God. That wording's a little misleading because we're not actually giving Him anything. We're actually returning to Him what's already His, what He lets us borrow. That concept becomes a little clearer when we look at the book of Exodus. In chapter 13, the Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me every firstborn male. The first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether human or animal." Now, previously in Proverbs, God wanted the first fruits of the field. And now in this passage, He's saying to the Israelites, I want the first of your flocks, and even your firstborn sons I want consecrated to me. And we might notice God's pretty focused on getting the first portion of things, being prioritized above everything else. We might ask, why? Well, He tells us in this passage, because it belongs to me. You see, all of it is already His. This idea of giving is kind of a misnomer. We are returning to God what He lets us borrow. And when we prioritize Him with what we are borrowing, He tends to be very, very happy and pleased with that and blesses. I'll give you an example. My roommate and I, when we lived together in college, we had a great relationship, and there was one day where it snowed pretty heavily. I was delivering pizza at the time, so I needed to borrow his car. He had a 4x4 SUV. I had a 1994 Ford Thunderbird, fantastic car, but it was garbage on the snow. So I borrowed his SUV. I did my shift. Went great. And before I gave it back to him, I cleaned out all the delivery slips, those little pieces of paper you get. I gassed it up. I made sure it looked good, and then I gave it back to him. He's very appreciative. I had a buddy in college, worked at the same pizza place, also delivered. He borrowed the SUV one shift, did not clean out the delivery slips, did not gas it up before he returned, and my roommate was not pleased. Now, one of us got to borrow the car again. One of us did not. You take a guess who was who. So here's the moral of the story. When we are responsible with what we borrow, people are happy to lend. When we are responsible with what we borrow, people are happy to lend. It's the same way that a credit score works. Your credit score is a reflection of how responsible you are with what you borrow. And when people see you have a nice score, that you are flexible or that you're responsible, they're happy to lend. The bank will probably give you more money than you need. When you have that low score, that's a reflection that maybe you've had some irresponsible choices in the past. Banks are a little more hesitant to lend. When you're responsible with what you borrow, people don't mind lending. And God's not that different. Everything in this world is His, and He lets us borrow. And when we are responsible with what we borrow, when we prioritize Him and put Him first, He's more than happy to lend. And when God is your lender, guys, there is always way more than enough. You don't need to worry about running out. And by the way, He's not asking us to do anything He hasn't already done Himself. He asks us to put Him first, to give Him our best. He did that for us. He sent His Son into this world. He sent His best to die on the cross, to forgive us of our sins, to secure for us salvation and eternity. He didn't give us some secondhand offering. All right, He didn't give us what was left over. He didn't say, I'm going to take care of this and this and that. And if I've got time, if I've got some left over, then I'll save humanity when I get around to it. He gave us His best. And He asks us to trust Him with our finances the same way that we trust Him with our eternities. Nothing more, nothing less. This is the barn, understanding that when we prioritize God, when we worship Him with these gifts of finance He's given us, our lives really are blessed. We are a well-stocked barn. So let's wrap this up. Let's put a bow on this morning. We are selfish people. We all can admit that. We can probably think of a time this week where we were selfish. One of the biggest obstacles to selflessness is this desire to accumulate and to gain. But really the key to satisfaction and contentment in this life is to give. Not to live your life like a bag at a hole in the bottom where we just keep spending money faster than we can put it in, but to give. Be generous to others, be kind to others, prioritize God above all other things, and when your priorities are set in line, you'll be surprised at how blessed you really feel and how satisfying life can be. We worship a giving God. We follow a Savior who gave His life. We're called to be people who give, not selfishly, but selflessly. Let me pray for you. God, thank You for today, because it's Your day, and yet You let us have it. You give it to us. We thank You for this church, this building where we can gather and be warm. It's Yours. You supplied it. We thank You for the cars that we're going to get in after this to drive home, because You gave us those too. You gave us the homes that we're going to go to. You gave us the warmth that will shelter us from the snow. You've given us the food that we're going to consume and eat. You've put money in the bank for us to survive on and to live on. You're unusually and unexplainably kind and generous to us. And we know it's because You love us. And we just thank You for that love. We thank You for that generosity. And I pray that we would be people who are responsible with what You've entrusted us with, that we worship You, that we obey You with generosity, that we fight this temptation to find satisfaction in the material, and that we find our peace in You and Your love and in the good news of Jesus. I pray that we follow His example, that we be restored and renewed by His work on the cross. And it's in Jesus' name I ask all these things. Amen.